Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the brand new, in the process of opening, UnHerd Club. Yes, and if you are watching online, welcome to you too. This is a brand new venture which comes out of a few instincts more than a kind of detailed plan of action. And the instinct is, I suppose, also after the COVID era, where everyone was sort of isolated and being keyboard warriors and fighting this fight online in this increasingly nasty and often quite surreal way, there is something really different and magical about actually being together in 3D, in real life, in a room, and actually just having a discussion. It's much harder to hate people when you are with them in the flesh. And our sort of ambition here, our aim, is to bring into Westminster. We are here, we are a stone's throw from Downing Street in that direction. We are a stone's throw from Westminster Abbey in that direction. We could not be more in the heart of power. And yet we don't want to just reflect what we are hearing around us. We want to bring different ideas in. So when there are great thinkers, such as our guest this evening, who I'm about to introduce, coming from overseas, or people who are kind of zooming out a bit and looking at the bigger ideas instead of just the horse race or today's policy or whatever the argument on Twitter is, we want to have them here and we want to bring people together and we want to see if we can work it all out. So thank you for being part of this little growing but as yet nascent community. And let me introduce our guest, which is none other than Andrew Sullivan. So I have written on my little notes here, he is the most influential political writer of his generation. Uncontroversial claim. But normally I wouldn't do a whole sort of biography, but I just want to touch on a couple of things, because for me it's absolutely fascinating the journey that Andrew has been on. He is by birth a Brit. He heralds from Surrey and East Grinstead, I think that's right. Born a Catholic, had an absolutely stellar academic career with scholarships to Oxford. He was president of the Oxford Union. He then went to Harvard, where he also ultimately got a PhD in Michael Oakeshott. There is a Oakeshott book standing just behind him. At this point, he very shortly afterwards became a journalist. He became the youngest ever editor of the National Review.
No!
Is that not right?
The New Republic.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. People do get them muddled up.
It's the words.
The other one.
The letters in the same order. The other one of the New Republic, which was a conservative, is a conservative leaning magazine.
Nope.
And he, why don't you take over? You know what?
Sorry, I'm just. It was an old school liberal magazine, and the weird thing was that I was appointed editor, not being a liberal. That was the huge fuss about it.
But you made one of the very first. The thing I was about to say, I hope this is right, is that you made the argument for gay marriage.
Yep.
In, let's say, a conservative context, which at the time, which is we're talking early 90s, was kind of considered completely...
Late 80s, actually.
Even in the late 80s. Wild.
Yes.
Sort of outrageous.
Crazy.
And of course, in retrospect, looks prescient, to say the least. I'm going to fast forward through my hopefully
I'm sorry,
more
I don't mean
quite right.
I just wanted to make sure people didn't misunderstand.
After that, he almost single-handedly invented blogging with the creation of The Dish, which became this absolutely huge blog, and he was writing literally like one-line blogs every 5 minutes, and it ultimately led to, it was kind of a burnout for you because it just became too much. But he had grew this huge devoted following of people who are in a way still with you, I think, all these years later. He wrote for the New York Times Magazine, most recently New York Magazine, leaving in circumstances that maybe we will investigate. He was strongly anti-Hillary, strongly pro-Obama, and strongly anti-Trump. So he's basically managed to upset everybody, which makes him a friend here at UnHerd, because we like that kind of attitude. We don't like people who are sort of loyally only in one tribe. He is prepared to break the mold. What I wanted to start with, I mean, there is a huge amount that we could be covering, but I figured since we have managed to schedule this conversation exactly at the same time as the England-United States football match, And we will be getting updates, I hope, from Flo if there are any goals. So you don't need to panic that you are missing out. Is to see if there are common moods on both sides of this Atlantic that we should be trying to kind of observe. I feel one idea that's insufficiently explored is that the UK is actually ahead of the US in some respects. I mean, those of us who lived through 2016, most obviously, were aware that something very serious was happening in the spring when the Brexit result happened. And all of my American friends were just uninterested by it. As far as they were concerned, the old world was still there, and they only discovered that it wasn't in November. And there's been quite a few examples of it. And most recently, what struck me is, Andrew, you wrote a blog on your Substack, I should say, one of the world's biggest Substacks now. I think you're in the top 10 most subscribed to Substacks. And the headline of it was, "The Normie Centre Strikes Back." This came out after the midterms. And this is literally 2 weeks after we had the end of Liz Truss, the return of Rishi Sunak, and what felt very similar, I would say, which is that there was a sort of revenge of a certain kind of centrism. So let me start with that. What is the Normie Centre and how is it striking back?
Well, the elections, I mean, I'll be very honest, and I, like everyone else, thought that the Republicans do well. The midterm election is pretty classic. You've got massive inflation. You've got Biden barely cognizant of what's going on around him and other things. And I thought there would be a red, if not a wave, then at least a natural reversion. And there wasn't. It was a really complicated election. People voted really interestingly. And I must say, right now, after this last election, I feel more calm about the fundamentals of American democracy than I felt since he came down the escalator. In as much as in those states where the left has overreached, New York, California, big rise in Republican support. In the middle of the country, Republicans did pretty well. You know, Republicans will win the popular vote at the national level, which is something you probably missed. They'll win by about 2 points, I think, once they finish. They should be finishing in a couple of years. But there was a distinction between the Republicans who won and those who didn't. And every single election-denying Secretary of State, it's State Secretary of State, which is the person in charge of the elections, lost. And Trump's champions also faded at the last minute, except for DeSantis, who was the extraordinary exception to this rule by an extraordinary degree. 19-point victory in Florida is pretty staggering, to be honest with you. It's just, we haven't seen that in forever. Florida, if you remember, from 2000 through Hillary, Trump was the swing state. Not anymore. And so you had the elevation of a new post-Trump Republican in Florida. Then you had the demoralization of the Trump right. You had, to some extent, not as strong a response or reaction as I would have anticipated or did anticipate. This partly probably because I'm way too online. Most of the school board stuff on the woke curricula, on critical queer theory, critical gender theory in elementary primary schools went down. School boards became more anti-woke across the country from the ground up. And then something really important happened, which was that at a moment in that election when Republicans were in this, you know, imagine that night, they're like, damn, you know, we've bungled this, something's going wrong, but and we're really depressed about that. But then there's DeSantis, he's great, right? So yeah, DeSantis. And then Trump decided to take that moment to say, Ron DeSanctimonious down here, he wouldn't be anywhere without me. And that, whenever I think about when cults break, you find out the cult leader is having sex with 3 other people, or you find out there's a slip in the finances and you realize he's got 3 Rolls Royces. this was a moment when the Republican base needed some emotional support, and they actually got emotional abuse. And it was kind of fascinating to see that they'd suddenly, in some ways, understood deep down that he doesn't give a damn about them at all, never has, never will. And honestly, for my sins, I follow the nutty right because it's entertaining, if not terrifying at times. And the really hardcore Trump right were really mad at him. And I thought Trump would win as early as, basically, as soon as he started running, and was somewhat ridiculed. That I thought I knew Hillary can't win a national election, and so I have a history of, in some ways, overstating Trump's resilience, but you still came back to this cult-like phenomenon, which represented something really deep and real among a lot of people, which I think is entirely understandable and in some ways justified, if rather terribly implemented and exercised.
So does that mean that this is a good moment then? I mean, it sounds to me like it's just positive for you.
I'm an Oakshotian. I believe in balance. You know, in some ways, if you think Oakeshott was not a, let's just talk about him because he's right there. He wasn't a partisan of any kind. Turned down knighthoods, didn't like to be associated with the Tory party, which philosopher would, but he believed in a democracy having two impulses. Forgive me if this gets tedious, but there are two basic impulses he identified: the impulse towards civil association and the instinct towards enterprise association, by which he meant a vision of society that is essentially full of individuals doing their own thing, given liberty and freedom to figure out their futures, or a collective enterprise engaged in some common purpose and goal, which you organize and plan. Those are the two key models in the West of left and right in some kind of way, or liberal or illiberal, however you want to define those things. And what was interesting about Oakeshott is that, unlike Hayek, which was his critique of Hayek, is that he said both are necessary. The society does need collective action every now and again. There are things that happen that we need to get everyone organized and get moving in the same direction. But equally, we always need to have a restraint on that, which is the tradition of English conservatism, which is a small state, free individuals, and an enjoyment of one another's individuality and character and personality.
Okay, so you think
I think
this is
a
welcome
balance.
correction?
Yes, I supported Blair after Major. I voted for. I know. Sorry, I supported Clinton because I thought he represented a balancing of the right-wing revolution in a way that would integrate it better. So in some ways, I think of myself as a meta-conservative, which is that the goal is to keep the ship steady, even if at times that means supporting causes you don't entirely agree with, because the whole thing matters.
Okay, so let me take you on for 1 minute here. I want to talk about the left, because what's interesting with you is that you have fears of what the right can become. You have fears of what the left can become. You're trying to kind of navigate a different path. Some of us have fears of what the center can become. And there's something quite frightening, I would argue, about this kind of, as you call it, revenge of the normie centrists. Here we have, in the UK context, we have characters who have basically been out of power since 2016. And Jeremy Hunt is an example who comes to mind, but advising him a whole kind of series of people who were pretty much in power prior to 2016, who see this as a way to turn the clock back. They see, essentially, these were kind of inadequate people pursuing what they thought were stupid, crazy plans, and that now the grown-ups are back in the room, the grown-ups are back in charge. Old school ideas about economics are back. We're back to some sort of austerity, which is what we were obsessed about for years prior to 2016. And it feels like there's an attempt to say all of these ructions, these populist outrages, and all of these things that to some of us felt like they needed to happen, and they were expressing things deeply important to people. That genie can't be put back in the bottle, and it doesn't feel like those people who are now taking charge are prepared to think of something new.
I don't really agree with that for a couple of reasons. One, the most radical things that were attempted were actually enacted. Brexit happened, and in the US, basically nothing really happened under Trump except a big cut in taxes, which was not really part of his agenda. But some shift on China, which happened, which Biden has doubled down on in so many ways. A shift on immigration, which has since been completely abandoned. So that's true. That's a thing as usual.
Here as well as
here as there. I do think these forces were real. I think if they think they can ignore them, they're wrong. But I think we've also been through an extraordinary period in which the kind of spending required and borrowing required to get through a once-in-a-century epidemic and then this energy crisis is enough to put any strain on a system that requires some kind of sensible management thereafter to keep it stable. And ultimately, small c conservatives about stability. I actually think the US and the UK systems have performed pretty well. Now we can look at it over the last few years. You've had multiple governments, as it were. Well, not really, but you've had, a change of, but it's turned out you got your Brexit. Then you had your little flirtation with 1981 again, which is ridiculous. Supply side economics is absurd, and I've never bought it. I didn't buy it when Reagan was selling it. I blame Reagan and that for some of the massive debt the United States has. So I think this is a good adjustment to the center. Now, there are lots of other issues involved here, but I don't think it means that reform has to be dead. I don't think it means that you can't chart a future for Britain that isn't around Brexit. I don't think you should necessarily change anything on immigration policy. We can have a huge discussion. I think that Biden should shift on that. I'm not sure whether he can. That will be resolved in the next few years, I think, depending upon who wins the election in 2024. So I'm not so gloomy.
Okay, so the US context.
Yes.
I see you're quite upbeat about us over here in the UK. Is there such a thing as a center in the US now? What would that positive version of it look like? Because it's hard to make it out.
Well, how about the climate bill they passed? Now, maybe that's going to set off some people, but I'm actually a pretty strong environmentalist on the stuff, and I do think carbon needs to be gotten rid of. And they passed the most expansive, with Republican votes too, investment in that whole area that we've seen. That's moderation. We see a coalescence between the Republicans and the Democrats on Ukraine. You see it on trade in China, which is all new consensus, all of which I might add are sort of on 2016 grounds. There is a consensus we have to do something important about immigration, but it's so jammed and so toxic, they can't get it through.
But just weeks before the election, Andrew, you wrote a piece that we actually published here at UnHerd, saying why you were planning to vote for the Republican candidate in these midterms, because where you had hoped that Joe Biden might represent that kind of sensible ground, he had let you down because you found he was going in an extremist direction in all sorts of ways.
He did both at once. He was the climate stuff. I think is conventional. You might regard it as extremely left wing. I don't. I don't think the subsidies on energy is a totally controversial thing, unless you want to see the US and most of the West go under. But the cultural and social stuff, which I care about, he's completely surrendered to the hardcore left at a time when the mainstream media has also been captured by this faction. So my vote for a Republican, I will say in Washington, D.C., which is like In 2016, the
Not much danger.
percentage of Washington, D.C. residents who voted for Donald Trump was 4%. So it is not like I'm going to tip the balance anywhere. And every now and again, you need to do a protest vote to say, screw you. The week before I voted, after a year of staggering rising crime, including a 25% rise in carjackings, the DC Council lowered the penalties for carjacking in pursuit of racial equity. Well, I voted for the Republican and the Independent insofar as I could. And I think people did that in New York, and I think they did it in California, where they think they got rid of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. In these elections, the hard left loses. I mean, every member of the squad saw their majorities tumble. So it's complicated. But yes, Biden's better than any other. When you think of who else could replace him in 2024, that's where the real issue comes up, because who the hell do they have?
Yeah, and we should come on to 2024. Let me just ask on this cultural stuff. It's interesting that you have sort of focused on it and taken it so seriously, because a very common charge is that it's a mirage, it's an obsession of the right, it's a culture war, etc. Lay out for us what you think the threat actually is there, and how serious it's become.
Well, I've always been interested in these issues, whether it was gay marriage or feminism, or race and all that stuff in the 90s. That's how I repositioned the New Republic to be partly about the cultural issues as well as the purely political ones, because I think they are completely intact. But I think there is simply a worldview which looks at our society and sees primarily a war between various groups based on identity, which is essentially zero-sum, in which some people control other groups and other groups are controlled by other groups. And the job is to see, that's why people I love this word ally. Ally means you're in a war. You're not in a civil society. You can see the world that way, and especially race, class is one way you can see the world that way, in which every interaction is some kind of manifestation of class imbalance. And if you want to go through life seeing that, you can. If you want to go through life looking at this room and suddenly saying, how many people, how many women, men, who's racial, that is what's going through the mind all the time. And when you go to a college in America, that's what you're told. The most important thing to think about whenever you meet another person is, what group are they in? And are you at war with them, or are they at war with you? And it's a very beguiling thing. It's a form of racism that has always existed in America. It's just flipped around, in which you really do see people as representatives of these groups. And because race is so visual, you see it everywhere, and then you become obsessed with it until you get to this point where, if the room does not exactly represent the representation of these different groups in society, it's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Now that is built out of, and I don't apologize for this. It is built out of a kind of neo-Marxism. It is rooted in a postmodernism that denies certain realities of biology, of science, of a whole number of empirical enterprises, because it believes that the empirical exercise itself is a form of white supremacy, which controls the rest of the world and other non-white people. It is so reductionist in every single respect. And our societies in the West, in the US and UK particularly, is built upon the integrity and importance and inviolability of the individual, regardless of the characteristics attached to him or her, regardless of the group they're in. That is a whole different concept. It's a fundamental concept of what society is. You shift that towards this deterministic collectivism and fuse that with race, you're going to create, a war against all. You're going to create bitterness, you're going to create toxicity in workplaces, in families, everywhere. And you're not talking ever about a common goal which actually unites people. My point about the marriage equality movement was, this is not about, in so much, is about being gay. It's about gay people being allowed to be human, and to get rid of that identifier, to see us as absolutely indistinguishable in some respects, not all respects. And that's another thing. You can have civil equality with cultural difference. Absolutely you can. That's what's so brilliant about a liberal society. So I do think it's a fundamental question. I also think that by a couple of devices, mainly the capture, the self-conscious capture of various important cultural institutions, primarily the universities, but then also the professional associations, and then cynically corporate America, to buy into all this, to make it impossible for you to resist, for you to, and if you do say, I don't want to walk in here with a he, him pronouns when it's pretty bloody obvious what I am, and I'm sorry, I'm not entertaining that bullshit, because it reflects an idea that I'm not just me. And that is a deep fight. It's a very deep, long, old, ancient battle between freedom and collectivism. And when they have controlled, in a way that's never happened before, the elites the way they have, then, and that has also captured the media in a way, certainly in the US more than here, then I think we're in danger. If we stop seeing each other as individuals, as a free society will wither.
Do you think that argument is winning? I mean, again, this is now might sound insanely optimistic, but the trope I started with, saying that maybe the UK is slightly ahead of the US. If you look at, for example, the gender controversy and the question of trans and all of that, that sort of has been raging here ahead of the US. And it does feel, and there are some people in this room who've been prominent in that discussion, it does feel like a decisive shift in atmosphere on that question has taken place over here. And I'm wondering whether it might be that the US catches up in a year or two's time. How optimistic do you feel like if the normie center is returning, reality is also returning?
You did it here, I think, for two reasons. You have a bunch of extraordinarily irrepressible left feminists who never shut up about this and were right about this from the very start. And whenever I talk about this, someone yells at me on Twitter, "You're not paying attention to all the people who do." I'm like, I'm not. Sure, yes, absolutely. And the left in America is more, I think, tightly bound in identity politics than some elements of the British left, who traditionally have been more interested in economics.
Do you think it's coming in America? Do you see?
Here's what I see. I will say two things. One, there have been two long pieces in the New York Times, which is kind of it's how you understand the American elite, is really observing the minutiae of maneuverings within the New York Times' masthead. And but to get Emily Bazelon to write that long piece and then just to have another long, detailed, factually accurate, measured piece, it wasn't skewed again. It was a decent piece. I've read now two long, serious pieces, one about the risks of transition and the other about puberty blockers and the dangers of them in the New York Times, while we were being told for I don't know how many years, no risk, reversible, all great, you're a bigot. And that's huge. All the polling shows that the public is fine. And I just want to, it's good to say this. I really believe transgender people exist. I absolutely believe in their absolute equality, in the civil rights laws, in every single aspect of their lives, with just a handful of tiny exceptions where biology matters. And i.e. sports, women's spaces, prisons, and children. Now, those are very different issues. So I've always been pro-trans in that sense. I've always regarded the rights and dignity of transgender people to be inviolable. And they are human beings with an extraordinary challenge in their lives. Now, I'm not one of these people that thinks, oh, these poor people can't even tolerate a debate or all the bullshit. They can. Most actually transgender people you meet, most sane ones who haven't just been captured at 12, are very commonsensical about a lot of this stuff. It's also become blown out of proportion in some ways. Because in fact, there are very few actual, genuinely transgender people. There's a whole lot of people involved in it, which I think are not quite the actual experience of a transgender person, genuinely. So, and I do think all the polls in America say, yeah, Ron DeSantis' radical right-wing authoritarian position was not to teach children about gender identity or sexual orientation, to tell children that they, at 3, that they can become a boy or a girl or something else entirely, or neither, or a tree in some senses, in one book, that shouldn't be introduced until the age of 8. That's his outrageous proposal in Florida, and of course they then lied about it to make it the desire to create homophobia and transphobia that doesn't actually exist is extraordinary. And you'll look at the polls too. I think 80% support for transgender rights and equality. But should women's sports essentially be vulnerable this way? Also, big majorities against that because they're sane.
So that sounds, I would say, pretty optimistic.
Yes,
again.
I do too.
You're bringing the sunshine over.
The First Amendment is a wonderful thing. And whenever you despair in America, you realize as long as you have that right to speak and argue, and as long as you believe that people will essentially be open to argument and debate. And my experience in America, my 30 years of being an adult there, is actually an astonishing willingness to change. I mean, I lived through a movement that revolutionize things in a classic way by making liberal arguments based upon individuals and individual rights and what brings us together rather than what divides us as humans. What brings us together is what takes us apart is to say you're gay, you're straight. What brings us together is these are two people in love. It's a very human experience.
There's 2 things I want to get out of you before we are going to go to a little break, and then we are going to open out the conversation. One is to talk about New York Magazine, and the other to talk about Ron DeSantis. Which would you like to do first?
You go ahead. You
so
do with me as you wish, Freddie.
Give us the inside scoop here on what exactly happened.
Really?
So just to fill you in, Andrew is a top columnist at this point with New York Magazine, one of the big publications, and this is last year. Or is it now more than a year?
2 years ago. It's the summer 2020 where all the headings happened.
When all the craziness happened. And
the terror.
They basically stopped publishing your columns, or what exactly happened, and why did you leave?
Well, there's a long story, there's a short story, or whatever. But basically, one part of the story is that I was hired by one editor and he was replaced by another editor. And the editor I went to work for, Adam Moss, probably one of the greatest editors of the last 30 years in America, edited the New York Times Magazine. So I worked for him, really. And I never had, he published a piece in the New York Times Magazine in the 90s called The He Hormone, Why Men Are Different, about testosterone. So he was prepared, he was interested in ideas, but anyway, and I was very anti-Trump. As you can tell, I'm not exactly hard right in the sense that, I believe in climate change and I'm, all the rest of it. If I'm not acceptable, who would be? I had some issues with the Me Too movements. Like, I had one particular issue with what was called the shitty media men list, where a whole bunch of 70 people were just 70 men were named on a public Google sheet of being rapists or abusers in some way, in some incredibly vague arc of miscreants with no evidence whatsoever, or even claiming to have evidence, which is just horrifying. And I also, in the process of understanding about that, found out that, in fact, he's being pursued by a bunch of people who are completely, am I allowed to use the word misandrist? They were extraordinarily fervent about this. And I just have a basic due process belief, and I felt it was wrong. And I wrote a piece saying this is wrong. It's sort of a little McCarthyite. You don't you don't have a list of names that you don't even prove that are suddenly to be, and they all got fired and moved. It's not the way a liberal society works.
So what happened to that piece?
It ran, and another piece I wrote on that ran. But there was some junior. I don't work in the office. I work remotely in Washington. But younger staffers went to human resource HR and said, publishing these pieces by this man creates a hostile work environment. And slowly, everything I wrote began to be subject to the same protest. So my editor was besieged. I had to spend a whole day once in, they have to have these, what do they call them, open hours where everyone comes to abuse you.
That's fun.
And here's this like unbelievably liberal, cool dude who's run a magazine. He's done all sorts of things. He's gay, actually. And then, of course, the whole BLM stuff happened. The summer 2020, when they got rid of James Bennett at the New York Times, which was a kind of moment. These journalists, especially on Barry too, there's a faction of these journalists who really their goal in life is to shut down other journalists. This is what they're driven by. And they saw an opportunity to use the hysteria, and I don't use that, and the moral panic, let me use that about 2020, to just get rid of these people they'd always hated. They had a list, basically, and I was on it.
How did they succeed with you?
I wrote a piece that said, this rioting and this violence is unconscionable. We must make a clear distinction. And the rhetoric coming from the mainstream of that movement was clearly not in any way solidly criticizing what was going on. And in fact, some of them were like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's one of the chief work people at the New York Times, who ran the 1619 Project. She said she was proud that some of these rioters had 1619 spray painted over various statues that have been demolished. She's proud to call them the 1619 riots. There was that element, and the New York Times, the reason they got rid of James is he ran a piece saying we should bring order to the streets of New York City, which at the time, if you remember, it really was
your piece,
chaos.
what they didn't write.
So my piece, by that time, the copy editors and the sub-editors had developed this sort of guerrilla warfare against me and anybody else trying to write something. And so it's just exhausting. The fact check was really just view check. And it came down at one point to their refusal to use the word riots. As
they were mainly peaceful protests?
They were social unrest, because rioting has a negative connotation. And this is a just revolution. And therefore, and I said, nope. If a writer can't use the word he wants to use, then I'm not writing for you. And I'm not writing this column this week. So no column. And at the time, I was actually finishing off for them an 8,000-word piece on the history of plagues, which I've been researching for like 4 months, 5 months. They ran that the following week as their cover. But
it wasn't all of you that they didn't like.
They kept running me, and they didn't cite anything that I'd written. They couldn't name. I hadn't used a wrong word, or there was nothing they pointed to exactly. And so I was given, then I thought, well, that's fair enough. They're going in a direction, so I'll carry on till the election, then I'll move on. I had that, and he's like, no, you've got 4 days. So I was out by the Friday.
More for them, because
then I'd already been talking. I've been talking to Substack for many years, actually. I knew Hamish way back when, and they came to me first, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, because I had been the blogging pioneer, and so I was a perfect candidate for them, and they were looking for someone to sort of popularize it and sort of get its name out there. And I'm like, sure, but I'm done blogging. I can't do it. I'm just like, it killed me. I can't go back to that. And then weirdly, when I was high one day on the beach in Provincetown, I thought, what if I turned the dish that I used to do 40 times a day into a weekly thing? and recongregate the community. I hate that word, but there is actually a community of readers who are interested in real debate. Bring them together again. And this was before I got fired. So I'd already had talks with them. And in fact, we talked about building this thing as an escape pod, we would, if all things went wrong, we'd get into the escape pod and we'd go. And we actually had it all set up and ready. Substack was incredibly good. And so I didn't miss a beat. I said, see you next Friday. I always finish my column with see you next Friday. And I said, see you next Friday at Substack. And next Friday at Substack, I went on there. And we now have 125,000 people getting this every week.
I won't embarrass you by asking you to reveal the financials, but let me say that I think it makes you one of the best paid journalists in the world at this point, with the tens of thousands of paying subscribers that just pay Andrew to write from the comfort of his home. So he's nailed it.
Which is, of course, the sweetest. I mean, I'm incredibly lucky and happy and grateful, but fuck them,
Okay, we are going to take a break. I know I said we'd talk about Ron DeSantis. I guess we'll have to do that afterwards. We are going to stop the big live stream now. So to the people on YouTube who have been watching, thank you for watching. This will remain there. After the break, we will keep things inside. So live stream will stop. And I hope we've got some amazing people here. We can broaden the conversation to a lot of other things. And drinks are available in the bar. Thank you.